In this video, we will implement a PCA biplot in Python from scratch, and then test it on the iris dataset. PCA, or Principal Component Analysis, is a powerful, unsupervised technique for dimensionality reduction. Describing PCA is out of scope for this video. However, I do have an extensive blog article on this topic. There's a link in the description below to this blog article. Now, a biplot is a popular technique for visualizing PCA results and for understanding the structure found in the data. However, there is no native implementation of a biplot in Python, unlike other programming languages like R. So instead, if we want to make a biplot, we have to implement it ourselves. Now, before we get into the example, note that all coding shown in this video is done in a Jupyter notebook available on my GitHub. You can find a link to this notebook in the description below. Now, a biplot is actually a combination of two distinct illustrations. The first is what we call a scores plot, and this is a scatter plot of the individual data points projected onto the first two principal components found using PCA. Now, this plot provides an interesting way of being able to visualize higher dimensional data on a 2D plane. And looking at this scatter plot, we can see interesting structure in the data in terms of how these data points cluster or wherever they fall on the plane of the first two principal components. The second plot is what's called a loadings plot. And this is a vector diagram, and it shows the magnitude and orientation of the eigenvectors for each of the original features in our data set. Now, looking at how these vectors are arranged can give us an indication for how each of the original features influences the first two principal components, in which direction, and what is the magnitude of their contribution to either of the principal components. So putting these two together, we get a biplot. And looking at the biplot, it's a very succinct and quick way of being able to see what kind of interesting structure has been discovered in our data using PCA. Okay, so now we can start with our implementation and example. So the first thing that we're going to do is run this first cell, which will load in all the packages that we'll need. Note that we are dependent on 4 different Python packages, and these include pandas, matplotlib, mlp axes aligner, and scikit-learn. So let's go ahead and run this cell. And now we'll get into the function implementation. So here we are. The function's called biplot, and it takes in 2 pandas data frames as arguments. Now, these data frames will consist of the scores that come out of the PCA model, as well as the loadings. And so these are called respectively df scores and df loadings. Now, the first thing that we do is we use matplotlib to just create a figure and axes object. And I define the size of the figure here. And the next thing that we're going to do is set up our scores plot. So if you remember, this is a scatter plot of the scores that we get over the first 2 principal components. So what we are seeing here is I'm just setting up a scatter plot on our axes object. We have our df scores data frame, and I'm looking at the first 2 principal components, and they're labeled PC1 and PC2. So we just take in those values, and I've decided to color them blue. So that's just how I've set it up. And then I also label the axes. So the x-axis is going to be for the first principal component, PC1, and the y-axis will contain the second principal component, PC2. And that's basically it. That's for our scores plot. Next, I'm going to create a copy of our axes object. And this is just so that we can place our loadings plot on this second set of axes. We have a dictionary here, and this contains information for how I want the feature labels to appear on the loadings plot. So in this dictionary, I just specify that I want the text to be green, the weight, it's going to be written in bold, and I also set the font size as well. So now that we have this in place, we can now look at how the loadings plot will be created. So here we're going to loop over each of the columns in our loadings data frame. And the first thing that we're going to do is identify the magnitude of the contribution for each of the features to each of the principal components. And so that's what we have here. That's just going to form the tip, the X tip and the Y tip for our vectors. And once we have this information, then we can just draw a vector. And this starts from our origin in the middle at 0, 0, out to our tip, which is defined by tip X and tip Y. I'm going to color the vector red, and I've also set the alpha to be 0.5. Now next to the tip, I also want to write out the name of the original feature that is the origin for this vector. And so I do this in this line of code. So now that we have both our scores and loadings defined, the next thing that I want to do is use MLP axes aligner and just align the two sets of axes that we have to make sure that we don't just have ticks for the scores, but we have for the scores and the loadings. So all four sides of our plot are going to have tick marks on them. So once we have that all in place, then I just call show on our matplotlib object, and then we are done. So that's the whole implementation is right here. So let's just run this cell. And now let's work through an example. So as mentioned before, we're going to look at the iris dataset, and we could just load this in from scikit-learn. That's what I'm going to do in this line. And afterwards, we're going to use standard scalar on the predictive features just to make sure that we have data that all falls within the same range. So let's run that cell. And now we can do our PCA analysis. So the PCA that I'm going to be using here is again taken from scikit-learn, and we just create an instance of this object, and then I will call the fit transform method on our set of predictive features to generate our scores. So that's all we need to do to get the PCA scores. We have to convert this into a pandas data frame. And so that's what I do in this next line. So it's just simply a matter of fitting the scores into the data frame and then labeling each of the columns as PC1, PC2, PC3, up to PC4 basically for this data set. So then we have to generate our loadings data frame, and we do that just in a similar manner to the scores, except that here we're going to get the information for our vectors, the vector magnitudes, by calling this the PCA components class attribute. So this is what we're using, and we label each of the columns to be the same as the original features that are contained in our data. So that's all we have to do to get our scores and loadings. And now we can feed this into our function and generate a biplot. And here we go. So we can see that we have the first principal component on the x-axis. It's labeled here, PC1. PC2 is on the y-axis. And our blue dots represent our scores. So that's each individual data point projected onto the plane defined by these first two principal components. And so if we look at just the scores themselves, we can see that there are two distinct clusters of data. It may be possible that the larger cluster here to the right is actually two clusters that are just superimposed on each other. The reason I say this is because we know that the iris dataset actually consists of three distinct types of flowers. So it would make sense that this is actually just two clusters superimposed. Now the loadings plot is shown in red, and we can see these are the eigenvectors for each of our original features. And in total, the iris dataset consists of 4 features, so we have 4 vectors here. So what we can see right away is that the sepal length, the petal width, and petal length are all pointed in the positive direction for the first principal component, and they're all fairly horizontal. So what this tells us is that these 3 features contribute primarily to the first principal component. They don't contribute that much to the second principal component. And because they're all pointed in the same direction, it would indicate that these 3 features are probably highly correlated. And as such, they do not have a high degree of discriminatory power in terms of being able to predict which flower we are looking at. Now, in contrast to this, we can look at the sepal width, and it's actually pointed off in the opposite direction, and it contributes primarily to the second principal component, not the first. And so looking at this arrangement of vectors, it would seem to indicate to us that the sepal width is far more important in terms of being able to discriminate between the different types of flowers shown within the iris dataset. So this concludes the video. I hope you enjoyed this content and you learned something from this. If you did enjoy this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is always appreciated. And I will see you in the next video.